Hello, I'm Emma Louise Coffey and you're welcome to The Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's show, we're focusing on labour efficiency and grassland management. I'll be speaking to Kieran Kelleher from Curtin's research farm and Pat Clarke from Teagasc Athenry. But first I caught up with John Maher, campaign manager of Grassland, to hear about the initiative.
The background to the Grass 10 campaign is to try and improve the level of grass grown on farm and the level of grass eaten by the animals on farm. So, look, we know that the average level of grass grown on farm from the National Farm Survey in Teagasc is about 10 tonnes. However, we know the best farms, including research farms, can grow above 16 tonnes. So the reality is then we're trying to get more farmers up to that level. So the background then to the Grass 10 campaign is we know if we grow 14 tonnes of grass and we will eat about 10 tonnes of that. That's why it's called Grass 10. Equally, if we achieve 10 grazings per paddock in the year, we'll do the same figures. So for some, it's about measurement of grass and you know, talking about 14 tonnes of grass grown, 10 tonnes utilised, which is about 80% utilisation rate. For others who don't measure grass, then it's easy. Think about grazing rotations and achieving 10 grazing rotations per paddock per year is a good way of achieving the same target.
Following on from that, John, I see that you have principles for the Grass 10 campaign. So the first principle mentioned is soil fertility. Can you go through the background to this?
Yeah, look, there's about 4 pieces to the jigsaw, Emma. There is soil fertility, there's reseeding, there's grazing management, and there's grazing infrastructure. So we'll start with the basics, which is the growth of grass plants starts below the surface of the soil, and that's why we focus on soil fertility. So these things we're talking about here then are the lime requirement of the soil, the P status of the soil, and the K status of the soil. And
we have seen from results from soil samples in Ireland that soil fertility is quite low on farms. Could you give us then an input in terms of what the levels are, what we're seeing on farms in terms of soil fertility?
Yeah, correct, Emma. Yeah, unfortunately, soil fertility is not in a good place, and it has been deteriorating since 1992 or the early 90s. And we have to address that because we're going to carry more cows, we're trying to grow more grass, we're trying to produce more milk solids. So this doesn't come for free. So we need to fix the soil fertility so that our grass will grow better and our ryegrass plants will survive. And when the weather turns bad, that our ryegrass pastures will recover. So the basics of that start with lime, because lime affects the availability of the other nutrients like P, K, nitrogen, sulfur. So if we don't fix lime first, then we will affect the others. So the stats for the country are not great. You're right. 2/3 of the soils in the country are deficient in lime. So we have to address that straight away. And then we'll work on the P and K story. Unfortunately, about 2/3 of our soils are index 1 or 2, which is not good for ryegrass. They need to be 3 and 4. So, look, very quickly, 2/3 of the soil soils are deficient in lime, and 2/3 are deficient in P's and K's. We need to address that. So fertiliser and slurry strategy are a big part of that.
And then moving on to grazing management. Grazing management is at a low level on farms at the moment. What can we do to improve this on farm?
Yeah, the soil fertility story is relatively easily fixed if we put out the slurry and the P's and K's, right, in the right quantities and at the right time. We get a great response. So, for example, like some people are trying to use low P and K compound products. They're not suitable for where the industry is at. We need to be moving to products like 18, 6, 12, 07, 30, 10, 10, 20, products like that, muriate of potash. So once we get that piece fixed, then we move on to the grazing management piece, right? And this is the piece that will actually grow more grass for you, but also allow you to eat this grass. And really, this is about the 10 grazing rotations. And if we can get 10 grazing rotations in the year, we will graze the right grass on average. And the game is largely won and lost what happens between the first week or the middle of April to middle of August. There's 120 days. That's 6 20-day rotations. That if we do that, that's where the game is won and lost in terms of grazing rotations. So the 6 there, right? We have one at the start of the year, between turn out to cows to the middle of April. Then from the middle of August to the middle of September is another. Middle of September to middle of October is number 9, and then obviously number 10 is middle October to middle of November if we get there. But most people tend to struggle between the middle of April and middle of August when grass growth is at its maximum, and it's all about getting the grass grazed at the right stage. And this is the 3-leaf phase of grass. People know this, but they forget. So, after you graze the grass plant, 7 days later the first leaf appears. another 7 days later, the second leaf appears, and the third leaf appears on day 20. So every 7 days a leaf appears. When the fourth leaf appears, the first one dies, so therefore the cows are eating dead material. And when the fourth leaf appears, we get more stem, so the animals don't graze as well and perform poorer. So it's really about that 3-leaf stage of the ryegrass plant. And that's why we talk about 20-day rotations between middle of April to middle of August.
In terms of infrastructure, John, what infrastructure can farmers put in place to increase grass utilisation?
Yeah, most farmers do a reasonable job in infrastructure, like in terms of water, roadways, paddock fencing. However, at the shoulders of the year, when things become difficult in terms of weather, this is where this really comes into its own. And generally you'll see reasonable infrastructure around the parlour, but as we move further and further out into the extremities of the farm, this is where things become a little bit more difficult because the roadways are inadequate, or they're poor surface, or the paddock shape is wrong. And, you're asking the cows to graze that part of the farm at the start of the year and at the end of the year, yet the infrastructure is not great. So infrastructure being put in place allows you graze the grass that you grow, and that's why we put focus on then the use of strip wires, the use of spur roadways in paddocks to allow cows get to grass at times when grazing conditions are difficult, but at the same time get grass into diet, because that's where the high costs are. So the more grass we can put in by having better grazing infrastructure in place, the lower the cost of production we will have. Simply put, grass is 3 times cheaper than silage, 5 times cheaper than meal. So if we put the good grazing infrastructure in place, therefore we can get this grass and lower costs.
Just to emphasise that, you said that grass is 3 times cheaper than silage?
Yes.
And 5 times cheaper than concentrate to feed. Very interesting. And finally, looking at reseeding, what sort of proportions of the farm would you be looking to reseed each year?
Well, the people who are on top of the game in terms of reseeding, and when you do the economic analysis and all that, reseeding's not cheap. It's €700 a hectare, but 10% of the farm per year is what the best guys target. And I think that's good looking at the progress we have in varieties. However, I will say to you, it's the icing on the cake. The first piece to fix is soil fertility. There's no point in spending €700 per hectare on reseeding if the soil fertility is compromised, because the ryegrass plant won't survive if the lime status is not met or the P status is very, very low. So soil fertility starts first, then the grazing infrastructure is put in place. You put in your grazing management, and the reseeding is the last piece of the story for me. That gives you the competitive advantage when you've all the other pieces right. But if you can't grow the grass or can't eat the grass, then spending money on reseeding really is questionable, when money should be spent on infrastructure or on soil fertility first.
And finally, John, there's a lot of farmers starting out on their grassland journey in terms of improving grass measurement, improving soil fertility, and their grazing infrastructure. What is the first step that you could give these farmers in terms of advice on starting their grassland journey?
Yeah, the grass journey is a long journey, but a very rewarding one. But it takes time to master it all. So, like everything in life, where you can get help and mentorship, this is what matters for me in terms of grass. Unfortunately, grass changes every week, every season, every month, every year. So, you're dealing with that variability. And you have to manage all those different things, whether it's soil fertility, whether it's grazing management, whether it's improving grazing infrastructure. And there's a saying there, I get by with a little help from my friends. And that's what you need in terms of grass. Someone that will, or people, so it can be a discussion group, it can be a neighbour, it can be someone from Teagasc, it can be anybody who has knowledge of grass, and then you get them to share that knowledge with you. So you can work in groups of 2s, 3s, 4s, 10s, whatever it is. But find somebody who has this knowledge, work with them. People who do this will gain great reward, both the mentor and the person learning, because it's sharing of information, because grass changes so often and is so variable in terms of if its production, then you need this help to manage it properly.
John, what are your top 3 tips for grazing management in spring?
Okay, I think the 3 tips are for the first rotation to me are relatively simple. The first one is that you put a plan in place. And that's the spring rotation planner, right? And it can vary from different parts of the country and soil type. But the idea is that it's calendar based and it's date based and it's relatively easily followed, right? So it allows you to have grass in the diet of the cow as often as the cow can graze. At the same time, doesn't enable you to go too fast or doesn't enable you to go too slow. So it gives you a kind of a balance in terms of achieving grazing at the same time getting grassland diet of the dairy cow. For the vast majority of people who farm on reasonable land, that target is roughly to have 30% of the farm grazed by the 1st of March, about 2/3 of the farm grazed by Paddy's Day, and finish their first grazing rotation somewhere in early April. For those on heavier land, you'll modify that, and I accept that. And, I'll go to more extreme forms of heavier land. It could be as simple as this: by having roughly 30% of the farm grazed by the middle of March, another 30% by the 1st of April, so you have 60% grazed by the 1st of April, and finish the first round somewhere around the middle of April. So we've gone from the dry land to the extreme. A lot of people will be in between, but doing that process of the 45 to 60, 70 day rotation, whatever that is for you, allows you to get a planned approach in terms of finishing the first round on time and getting grass into the cow's diet as often as possible.
So just to recap on that, make a plan for the spring. Try and get as much grass into the cows as possible where conditions allow. Graze 30% by the 1st of March, 2/3 by St. Patrick's Day, and finish your first round by early April. Thank you, John.
No problem. Thank you.
Now let's hear from the farmers. Kieran Kelleher from Curtin's research farm fills us in on how he's preparing for the spring.
This week we have been preparing the calving boxes and also the single calf pins and the group pins. We've disinfected them and they're also bedded down now at this stage. And
then in terms of the cows, what way have you them housed in preparation for calving?
They're housed according to calving date nearest to the calving box. So there's 21 in each shed, so there's 7 sheds in total there. So they come down as according to their dates, down closer to the calving pin.
And in terms of supplies, what have you ordered and what have you ready in the yard for the upcoming calving season?
We've 2 pallets of milk replacer due in there now next week, so we have a couple of bags just in case we would need them at the weekend, but I would imagine we shouldn't have any cows calving this weekend, so that should carry. Hopefully next week we'll be prepared.
And you have the tags and the naval disinfectant ready.
Yeah, all that's ready to go now, and all this and we've all the disinfectants in place for the foot baths.
And Kieran, you mentioned you have some calcium boluses ordered for the spring. What are these for?
They're for the older stock in the yard. Anything that was prone to going down last year will get a bolus immediately after calving. So just to prevent that happening again.
And in terms of the number of cows, how many cows have you calving in Curtins this spring?
There's 150 calving there in total, and there's 86% of the cows calving the first 6 weeks.
Okay, so that's working out at about 130 cows.
Yeah, 130
calving
cows
in the first 6 weeks. So you'll be very busy between now and Patrick's Day.
Yeah, we'll be kept going all right. So.
Any of the other jobs you're doing on the farm prior to the calving workload?
Yeah, in the next maybe 7 to 10 days, we're hoping to get out the slurry and fertiliser, weather permitting, just before we need hands on deck once we start calving. As you can see there by the calving rate, we're going to be fairly busy, so let's try and get that done next week.
Thank you, Kieran. We'll be catching up again on the performance at Curtin's farm in the next month.
All right, thank you.
Finally, on this week's show, Pat Clarke from Teagasc Athenry talks us through labour-saving tips on our farms this spring, starting with the average number of hours worked per week.
A survey would have shown that dairy farmers in springtime are working an average of 72 hours per week in the spring period. That's over 10 hours per day compared to an average of 62 hours over the whole year. That probably doesn't tell the full story though, because that 72 hours is generally spread over the 24-hour period as farmers are working late, getting up early to assist with cows during the calving period.
And if you talk about that being the average, Pat, in terms of 72 hours, you know, there are people working less than that and more than that. You know, what is the max you would have heard of hours worked per week?
Absolutely. There would be some people who would be working 80 to 90 days in springtime, which is an enormous amount of working hours during the week.
And if you consider the workload there, Pat, around, you know, the average of 72 hours, is it necessary for farmers to be working that much, or can they, you know, select tasks that somebody else can complete?
Yeah, so where some of the more efficient farmers are obviously planning and they're looking at their spring workload not being sustainable, so therefore they have to take away some of the work from themselves. So One of the obvious choices farmers have made over the last couple of years is to use contractors where appropriate during that period. For example, to get the slurry spread by contractor, get the fert spread by contractor. An obvious advantage there is that they're not doing the work themselves, but also contractors will tend to do it in a quicker time. One of the speakers at at the Irish Grassland Association conference this week said that it was taking him 2 days to spread the fertilizer during the February period. When the contractor came in, it took a half a day because the contractor had more appropriate sized machinery for that task. The other area then that people look at reducing their workload during that time is that they realise that they need additional help. But again, now is the time to be looking at it or in advance of the busy period to see, first of all, how much help do they need, and secondly, who is available out there and what particular skills they have got. For some people, it's a full-time employee that's required, but for others, some relief staff coming in, maybe doing some milking, maybe giving a hand with calf rearing, maybe it's somebody that can do some weekend work. That can really be the help that will allow farmers to get over this busy period.
And when we're talking about that workload and trying to become more labour efficient, we can probably break down the workload in the spring into different areas: say calving, milking, calf rearing, and grass. Have you any tips in terms of what farmers can do in the next month or two to reduce the workload around calving?
Yeah, so the first one, calving, I think you could nearly look at that on two sides. One would be the actual calving, and secondly would be the whole movement of cows, calves, and facilities. So if we take calving, lots of people are putting great emphasis now on getting cow body condition correct. So cows in poor condition or over-conditioned cows will have more difficult calvings, more assistance required, and therefore more labour. So get cow condition right. There still is time, during late January into February to keep cow condition right.
And we're talking, just to interrupt you there, Pat, but we're talking about a target of 3.25 when we talk about the correct body condition score.
We are, yeah. And it's surprisingly for people, most people will know what a cow should be when she calves down. So it's a matter of making sure that if you have 10 cows, fat cows, that you adjust to the 3.25 or the ideal cow for calving. The other couple of issues around calving are, one is the use of sires that was used. Obviously, that's too late for this season, but next year's breeding season isn't too far away. Use easy calving bullers, particularly in the second half of the breeding season. And the third one is animal health. Have a correct animal health procedure in place and dry cow minerals. So put big emphasis on getting the cow right at calving time. The second part of calving then is the actual facilities and the movement of stock around calving. Look at your calving area. Is it the appropriate size? Is it easy to feed animals in it? Is it easy to separate animals in it? Is it easy to clean it out? And many farmers have made adjustments to make life easier in that regard by maybe creating an extra door, an extra passageway, maybe putting in a self-feed silage place for their calving area. And then looking at movement of stock, can you move cows pretty securely and safely from their main cubicle house or houses to the calving area, and can you move calves pretty easily from the calving area to their calf accommodation? And anything that will simplify the process of calving and reduce the amount of time you're moving animals is a big help during that period.
In terms of then, when we look at milking and labour efficiency, what do you see the efficient farmers doing to reduce labour around the milking process in the spring?
Milking on a farm typically takes up a third of the working year, so it is a big process. Around calving time, some of the things that the most efficient farmers are doing, they may be training heifers to the parlour, so that for a number of days during January, they get heifers familiar with the feeding, the noise and the movement around the parlour. They may be increasing cow flow around the parlour, both into the parlour and out of the parlour, so that cows move much more easily. And the other practice that some farmers have adopted for the first 4 to 6 weeks of calving is to milk cows once a day.
In terms of then, when we look at the calf rearing is a very time-expensive task on farms and just the general care of calves. Have you seen any practices that will reduce the labour workload around calf rearing?
One of the practices that farmers have adopted quite readily in recent years is getting adequate colostrum into calves. And farmers will quite openly say that following the the 1-2-3 ruling or guideline is that calves will be more healthy by getting this early colostrum, and healthy calves mean less work. So getting the calf off to the correct start is vital by getting colostrum into that calf early on. So putting a bit of effort and thought about how you're going to do that can pay dividends later on. The other thing with calf rearing is the whole idea is to try and simplify it, is to try and get easy movement of milk. Minimize the number of sheds that you're going to. It's too late, obviously, to build a calf shed at this stage, and to be able to move the milk freely to the calf houses. Provision of hot water, obviously, near the calf feeding area is important as well. Many farmers would do that. And then once calves become 4 weeks of age, you could consider once a day feeding a calf. Again, Moorepark trials have shown that animal performance is quite satisfactory when they're fed once a day from 4 weeks of age onwards, and labour input is reduced.
And just in terms of the whole housing versus getting cows out to grass, where conditions allow, are we going to be more labour efficient if we get the cows out rather than housing them?
Oh, of course. Cows, once cows start calving, where they can get to grass almost immediately, you cut down on the shed work, you cut down on the indoor work. So have a plan to get cows to grass as quickly as you can. Some farms obviously are restricted because of ground conditions, but quite a lot of farms can get them out. Think about it in advance. Have you got your paddocks split with temporary wire? Have you got reels and posts in place in your paddocks? Have you got sufficient openings in your paddocks that will allow you to get into a dry bit of ground for a half a day, or maybe for 3-hour grazings? So when cows are out of the shed, is that it's work removed from the yard. There's less feeding, less cleaning of the sheds, and generally speaking, the cows are going to perform better as well.
If we look at the overall labour picture, Pat, you presented at the Irish Grasslands conference, and you were saying, the average farmer is spending about 47 hours per cow per year in terms of labour input, and then the top 5% farmers are at about 25 hours. Can you give us an overall picture of what type of farmer you were looking at and how many farms were included in your labour study?
Yeah, so we worked with some discussion groups, and we ended up looking at 70 discussion groups, about 1,000 farmers in total. There were typical farmers that were out there that are in discussion groups, and we looked at their labour input, so who was working on the farm, quantified the hours the farmer put in, family put in, and employees put in, and then looked at practices and facilities on those farms as well that might be contributing to labour efficiency or inefficiency. So, the range was going from the low 20s up to the mid 40s in terms of hours of work per cow, regardless of who was doing those hours. And what it was really saying that some farms are pretty efficient in terms of hours of work, but there is a lot of scope for others to reduce the input of work per cow.
And in terms of the herd type, were these seasonal calving herds? Were they a mix? Were they spring or autumn?
There were a mix. So there was spring calving herds, there was autumn calving herds. It doesn't really make any difference what system you're in. If you analyse and you see that there are other people more efficient than you in your system in terms of labour, then it allows you to start asking questions about your own system.
And when you're identifying, how labour efficient or inefficient a farm is, what are the metrics or KPIs that you considered as the measure of labour efficiency?
Yeah, probably not as easy as we'll say grass utilised per hectare is very clear cut, 6-week calving rate is very clear cut. When it comes to labour, it's a little bit more difficult. Three of the metrics that we used, the first one you've mentioned already, hours of work per cow. So that quantifies how many hours of physical work per cow on the farm. So obviously the lower the hours, the more efficient in terms of work per cow. But sometimes that doesn't tell you what the individual farmer is doing. So then we also looked at the number of hours per week that individual farmers were doing. So you could be very efficient in terms of hours per cow, but if you're running yourself into the ground, obviously that was going to be a sustainability issue there with the person. So there were two of the metrics we looked at, and another metric we looked at as well is output per labour unit. So in other words, how many kilos of milk solids has been produced for every labour unit of work that's on your farm. So those were three metrics. They're interchangeable, they're intermixed, but it's very difficult to look at one in isolation.
Okay. And when you looked at the results of this experiment, I know you presented them at the Grassland conference, But in terms of what are the main differences you see between the average and the most efficient farmers within the study?
I'm going to say it's very difficult to answer that. We looked at a lot of different variables. What I would say, though, is that you could look at the facilities and practices, you could nearly break them into two. So if you look at the facilities part of it, first of all, efficient farms will tend to have better milking facilities, better grazing infrastructure, better organisation around their facilities. That is one thing that will show up. But the second thing you would look at is the practices. So one can have the facilities in place, but if they don't have the practices, but what I mean by practices, the most efficient guys will have regular milking times, set milking time in the morning, a set milking time in the evening, and the evening milking time will be earlier. So that's a practice rather than a facility. A higher proportion of the efficient guys will have 3 grazings per paddock during the summer. A higher proportion of them will feed calves once a day. A higher proportion of them will practice once a day milking when appropriate, be it spring or be it autumn time. So those are really system changes that require the farmer to change. So I would say that if you look at the most efficient farms, yes, they're improving their facilities, but they're also changing the way that they work to make themselves more efficient.
Okay, and then based on those results, what was the difference in the number of hours between your average and your top 5% farmer?
Well, again, if you look at the hours per cow, the average in discussion groups was 47 for the 1,000 farms that we looked at over a 4-year period, and the most efficient were 20 hours per cow.
20
so you're
hours,
really looking at 20 versus 47.
Okay, so over double the amount of time.
Yes.
Okay. And finally, Pat, what are your top 3 tips for managing labour this spring?
The first thing I would say is simplify the system, so that if you're trying to manage labour on a farm, the simple system is the easier it is for everybody to understand. I think the second thing is decide who's going to do the work in advance. So have some type of planning into who's going to do the different tasks, be it calving cows, be it recording, be it milking, be it putting cows to grass. So give consideration to that. And I'd say the third thing would be to change the practices. So that if you look at the most efficient herds, look at what practices they're doing, and that if you want to ease your workload, change the practices.
Pat Clarke, thanks for all your tips on labour efficiency this spring.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this week's episode of The Dairy Edge. And my thanks to John Maher, Kieran Kelleher and Pat Clarke for joining me on the show. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.